property and tech transfer and how we do it here at Berkeley Lab. It would be nice if it was an interactive conversation. So if you do have a question, as Ruby indicated, please take yourself off of mute and ask, or add it in the chat box, and Ruby will bring it up to the group. So, my slide, there it goes. Okay. Just a couple of important points to remember is that IP and tech transfer are really important to DOE and UC and Berkeley Lab. And it's also potentially important to you because there is a personal benefit in that all co-inventors of a given technology equally share in 35% of the net IP income. The second point to remember is that public disclosures in a kind of academic context, it's often journal articles or posters or presentations at a conference, those can affect intellectual property. And so to just keep that in mind as you're developing a technology. And then the third, which I think is the most important of all, is please talk to us if you have questions. There'll be contact information scattered throughout the different presentations. Please note if you have a question, if you don't answer it here, or excuse me, ask it here, you can follow up with us after. So we'll start with the basics of patents and copyrights. And those are two types of intellectual property. And IP is a creation of the intellect, and the rights conveyed through intellectual property grant you as the creator, either as an inventor of a technology or an invention, or the developer of software code, you get to control the rights associated with that IP. There are four kinds of IP: patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. Here at Berkeley Lab, we almost exclusively use and pursue patents and copyrights. Sometimes we'll pursue trademarks. Trademarks are kind of like the name of Coca-Cola, right? So the company Coca-Cola trademarks the brand or the name such that it can keep imposters from using its name and tarnishing its brand. It's really important to note that Berkeley Lab and the University of California and DOE generally don't use trade secrets. To continue with the Coke theme, the formula for Coca-Cola is actually a trade secret, which means it's held very close to the vest of the Coca-Cola company, and it gets certain rights and privileges by considering the formula a trade secret. It never has to disclose it to anyone, and it gets certain protections from kind of unauthorized disclosure. If someone takes the formula and quits their job at Coke and tries to publish it, Coke has some legal recourse because it is a trade secret. As I mentioned, though, we deal primarily in patents and copyrights here at Berkeley Lab, and I'll go through kind of a table that summarizes patents and copyrights. So what they protect. So a patent is all about a kind of a tangible, it's either about a thing or a process. And that thing or process has to be novel and useful and not obvious. So there are certain things that can be patented and certain things that can't be patented. And I'll provide a little bit more description of what is novel and useful and not obvious in a second. Copyrights are essentially a creative expression in a tangible medium. So probably where you've heard of copyrights, software, where you have, expressed a code in a computer terminal into digital ones and zeros representing that code. That is a creative expression in a tangible medium. And again, that can be used for software. It can be used for engineering drawings or schematics. It can be used for songs. It can be used for images or paintings. It can be used for a lot of different things. So what rights does a patent grant and what rights do a copyright grant? So a patent allows you to prevent others from practicing your invention, making it or using it or selling it. And it's important to note that for a patent and also for copyright, what you get is the ability to prevent others from doing something. It doesn't necessarily give you the ability to do it yourself. So just as an example, let's say that you have invented a great bike seat, and your bike seat is more comfortable and cheaper to manufacture or whatever than competing bike seats. You can you can prevent others from making your bike seat, but you can't necessarily make your bike seat yourself if you need rights to other patents, maybe for a simpler bike seat to make yours. So the idea here is that patent rights convey, patents and copyrights convey certain rights, but not necessarily all rights that you need for commercialization. Copyrights allow you to prevent others from performing or displaying or reproducing or preparing derivative works, etc. So it's kind of like if a musical artist samples a song, they don't get to just change a little note or change the rhythm or something like that and say, oh, it's my completely new work. It's clearly a derivative of that original song, and so there are protections for that original artist. The scope, these vary pretty widely. So the scope of a patent is 20 years, and it is country by country. So each country you want patent protection in, you have to choose that country and pursue protection there. For copyrights, it's very, very long life. It's the life of the longest lived author plus 50 to 75 years. So if people collaborate and the last person dies in 1950, that invention or that copyrighted work might not be in the public domain until 2000 or 2025. And then the scope of copyrights are worldwide. So it isn't something that you pursue country by country. As soon as you get your copyright, you get it everywhere. And the last point is, how do you get these different types of IP? So for a patent, it is a negotiation with the patent office in each country that you have chosen to file in. And once you file in a country, it is a 2 to 5 year process at the cost of tens of thousands of dollars to try to get a patent. And there's no guarantee that you will. You're in this negotiation, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And I'll again explain a little bit about why you might win or why you might lose in a second. A copyright is immediately granted as soon as you express and put that expression into a tangible medium. So kind of simplistically, if you have a notebook and you scribble a bunch of stuff in it, technically you have copyright as soon as you scribbled in that notebook. You might not want to do anything with it because it might not be very valuable, but you do technically have it. So that's a little bit of a side-by-side comparison of patents and copyrights. And again, the key thing to keep in mind here is Berkeley Lab really deals in 2 types of IP: patents for our inventions, our technologies, a new method of making a chemical compound or a new device for performing some kind of function or technique, and copyrights for software that's been authored and schematics. So if there are engineering drawings for how to manufacture an instrument or a given technology, those can also be copyrighted. So I'll talk a little bit about patent prosecution. As I mentioned, patents are pursued country by country, and they are expensive and they take a long time to get. And so it's really important to understand kind of how that process might play out when you're deciding whether or not to pursue a patent in a given technology or not. So the idea behind patent prosecution is it's all about this white space. You have an invention, and your invention, you can imagine it covering like a white space. Now that white space has to be useful and novel and not obvious. Your invention has to be useful in that you can't just be wasting the patent office's time patenting something that has no utility or no function, because no one wins from that. It has to be novel, which means your invention cannot have existed in a single reference, a single journal article, or a single poster, or a single device already sold on the market. And it has to be not obvious. And this one gets a little tricky in where a lot of the discussion happens and negotiation happens with the patent office. Not obvious means you can't combine multiple references into your invention in an obvious way. So let's say your invention is step A and B and C, and let's say one reference has A and B, and a second reference has B and C. The patent examiner might say, well, if I had those 2 references and I look at them side by side, I can get A and B and C, and so therefore A, B, C, that's your invention, that's obvious. So it's a discussion, and a critical point is during all of this, obvious is used in a legal and patent context and not in a scientific context. And there can be technologies that are completely not obvious in a scientific context, but considered obvious, or at least be argued as obvious in a patent context. The last point to make is that the patent examiner who is representing the patent office is not the enemy. They're not opposing counsel. They're not presuming that your invention should not be patented. They're just trying to ensure that the law is implemented properly. So here's a kind of a diagram of this idea of patent prosecution, because this is where a lot of the magic happens. So let's say your invention is described by this white space here. So it might be a chemical compound where you have lots of different elements that you can swap in or out, for example. So you have this white space and you define this white space, and then you say, hey, patent office, my invention covers all of this white space. The patent office looks in the prior art, they look in the published journal articles and poster presentations and whatnot, and they see not quite. I found two types of prior art. Maybe there's an issued patent over here represented by the orange triangle. Maybe there's a journal article represented by the green pentagon. And some fraction, there's a little bit of overlap, as you can see. And so, you won't get this full kind of teardrop shaped white space. You'll get what's left, what's still white. But that's just one step, because that's about novelty. That kind of territory, if you will, has been covered by these prior art. The next step is to figure out obviousness. Now, obviousness is tricky, like I explained, because on some level, everything is obvious in hindsight. And so it really becomes kind of a discussion and the job of persuading the patent office that this kind of encroachment of obviousness does not cover your entire inventive white space. And the way you deal with that is you kind of build in fortifications. A kind of analogy that I like to use is, you can imagine patent prosecution as kingdom building, right? The more territory you have, the more powerful you are, but the more territory you have, the harder it is to defend. And so when you're writing a patent application, just like when you're engaging in a military campaign, you always want to have fallback positions. So if things go poorly on the Western Front and this journal article prior art has broken through your defenses, you have fallback positions, right? You're able to kind of redefine what your white space is. So here, if we have proper kind of fallback positions, we can get what looks to be kind of an hourglass white space. If we don't have proper fallback positions, then we could lose everything, and the patent office could say your entire white space is obvious. And then you got to go home, and you've lost out on tens of thousands potentially, and 2 to 5 years of your time. So that's a little bit of how patent examination works. One other point on patent prosecution is you can protect your invention in a bunch of different ways. It's called claiming your invention. So there are different types of claim types. So I'll put them all on here. The first is like a composition of matter. This is kind of like a chemical compound, and the example I have here might be salt. Of course, we don't have a patent on salt, and I don't think anyone does it at this point. But you can substitute any kind of arbitrarily complex molecule. And you might have different levels of impurities because you don't want to be so precise when you're trying to protect something with patents that you make it too narrow, too specific. So you might have a composition of matter. You might have a device where, again, in the spirit of salt, you might have a salt spray chamber for corrosion testing, where you have a device that's got a chamber full of salt and a chamber for your sample and a nozzle to spray the salt on the sample and then testing the corrosion. You can have a method of making. So you might make salt by drying out seawater with sunlight. You might use salt by adding salt to water to increase the boiling temperature for cooking, for example. So there are lots of different ways to claim an invention, but they're not all created equal. So the really important thing to keep in mind in kind of patent prosecution is you generally want to try to protect physical things as opposed to intangible processes, or processes that might be difficult to track. And just as an example of this, let's say I have a patent on the composition and matter of salt. I can go to the store, buy some salt, analyze that salt, and if it is in fact my patented salt, I know whoever's selling that salt is infringing on my patent. And that's the utility of a patent, is that you're able to identify infringers and stop them, so you have some degree of monopoly. If you have a method of using salt by adding it to water and to increasing boiling temperature, that's really, really hard to understand if someone is infringing on your patent, because that happens in individual homes. And someone just selling salt is not sufficient to infringe on your patent. So there's different values. And generally, if you have choices, you would generally pursue compositions of matter and devices, physical things that can be kind of seen and discovered on store shelves. You would generally prefer to pursue those. So that's kind of a high-level summary of patents and copyrights, and a little bit about how you actually get a patent and the different types of patent claims you can pursue. A comment on copyrights. Copyrights are much less risky because they are granted immediately. They are granted in every country, or at least essentially or effectively every country, and they last a really long time. And they're free. So copyrights are a little bit easier to get, are much lower risk, but they have a relatively limited, relatively limited commercial value. So that's kind of the trade-off. So I'll talk a little bit about IPO transfers. So how does IPO and Berkeley Lab transfer technology? So it's a 4-step process. Step 1 is we intake and evaluate the technology. As I mentioned, patents are really, really expensive, and they take a long time, and they consume a lot of resources, and we frankly don't have the resources to pursue all of them. So we need to prioritize. We need to evaluate. We need to prioritize. Next step is to process that IP, kind of what I just described. Filing a patent application and prosecuting a patent application, or securing a copyright. License development and license maintenance is really the sales cycle. A couple of details on each of these processes. Intake, we need to bring and encourage disclosure and evaluate and prioritize and develop IP strategies for each invention or each software that's submitted. We need to draft secure patent applications, copyright permissions. License development is about conducting business development and finding companies to do this process or do this commercialization on our behalf. And then license maintenance, it's really important that we hold our licensees to the obligations and commitments that I've made to us and to you all as inventors. And now there's a team here that does this and works with you and supports you in this process. It starts up front with the intake and evaluation with a person we call the Technology Commercialization Associate. So this person is kind of the front of the funnel, if you will. That TCA works very closely with a patent attorney who does this patent prosecution and copyright permissions. The TCA then steps back in and does license development and license maintenance, and is supported by a licensing associate, also called an LA. So this team of a TCA, a patent attorney, and an LA, this team is dedicated to you and the specific divisions that they represent and they work with. And here's the different TCAs and points of contact within IPO for each division. So Gregg Scharfstein, who'll be speaking later, represents the energy sciences and physical sciences area. So if you're from either of those areas or any constituent divisions, Gregg is at least your entry point into IPO. So I encourage you to make a note of his email. And that's true of all of these points of contact. Shanshan, who will also present later, represents energy technologies area. Sebastian Ainsley does computing sciences, all of computing sciences and constituent divisions, as well as energy geosciences. And Sebastian is also our software guru. So if you know you're dealing with software, you can go directly to Sebastian regardless of where you are, or you can approach one of these points of contact and they'll help you and get you to the right person. Peter Bluford works with biosciences and climate and ecosystem sciences, and Robin Johnston works with JBay. So we'll be distributing these, but I would encourage you, if you have questions, to make a note of kind of the point person for your division or your area as the person that you can contact first. But regardless, contact us and we'll get you to the right person. A little bit on this different process, the tech transfer process, encouraging disclosure and how to disclose. So if you think you have an invention or you're writing some software that you think might be useful or should be released to the public, be it under an open source license or a commercial license, please talk to us. We will have you complete a record of invention or a software disclosure. And we've recently revisited that and hopefully made it a lot easier to submit these forms. Important sections of the forms: who invented it? In patent law, generally kind of the rights go to the inventors or the developers or the authors, whoever generated the intellectual property. And in our case, because you all are likely employees of Berkeley Lab manages that IP on your behalf. Another important point is funding. So often funding comes in and there are rights and obligations associated with it. So we would like to know who funded the research or funded the development of the invention of the software, so we can make sure we comply with all the obligations that we signed up for when we put the money in. Next up is, what did you invent? What's the background? Why were you working on the subject? What's the description of the technology that you think might be useful? And how might it be used? And then last is, we mentioned up front that public disclosures can really affect patent rights. So we'd like to understand what disclosures have been made. And then a third-party code is important for software because, again, if we take in or bring in third-party code under certain rights and obligations, we want to make sure that we comply with those when we release our code. We talked a little bit about evaluations, and it's important to note that patents are expensive, they consume a lot of resources, and they take a lot of time, so we need to prioritize. And we do that in a number of different ways. I'll put them all out here. So a couple of these factors are technical. Where is the invention in its technical development? What is kind of the timeline and the required resources to make it a product that could be sold? Now, once you have a product, what is its potential impact? Will it have economic impact and return large royalties to Berkeley Lab that we can distribute to the inventors or distribute to scientists? Does it have societal impact? Will this technology, although maybe it doesn't bring in a lot of royalties, it'll have a really profound impact on people's lives or on society? And then programmatic, will this IP help Berkeley Lab in developing its research programs? A lot of funders are becoming increasingly interested in tech transfer and intellectual property, and sometimes having a patent or a patent application or a copyright can go a long way in persuading a funder to provide funding for a given type of research. And then last of the factors is IP. So we talked a little bit about patentability. How likely is it for us to find that inventive white space? What types of claims can we get for this invention? Can we get the relatively more valuable composition of matter or device claims? Or would we be pursuing methods of making or methods of using, which just as an aside can be very valuable and very worthwhile. Then there's other kind of ideas around licensability and enforceability. Say you got a patent, that's great, what can you do with it? So these are all factors that we have to look at when we're deciding, there's a technology from earth and environmental sciences and from energy sciences and from ETA and biosciences. There's this whole mix of technologies and we can only pursue about half. We have to decide, we have to choose. And so these are kind of the factors that we generally consider. As I mentioned before, software is relatively lower risk than patents. So what we really try to do is determine the best approach to licensing. Do we want to open source and just let it out into the world, come what may? Do we want to pursue academic or commercial or some combination of licensing? And a really important point that I'll make again is, the evaluation of the prioritization is not related to the quality of the underlying research as a scientific endeavor. When we decide to pursue or to not pursue a given technology, it's really with these factors above involved. You'll notice that none of it says this is really awesome science and is going to get published in Nature, right? That's not the criteria that we need to use to decide investing, these tens of thousands in kind of the commercialization of the technology. A little bit on why we license IP. I've mentioned this before, but we do research. As you know, we don't sell products or make products, so we need to partner with startups or established companies. The way we do that partnership is through these licensing agreements and licensing of IP rights. And just as a comment, Berkeley Lab and the University of California generally, we don't sell our patents or our copyrights. We license them. And it's kind of analogous to leasing a car where you might get access to that car for 3 years and 10,000 miles or 30,000 miles or whatever, but you don't actually own the car. And so we do that where we take that approach where we say, you company, you can sell a technology that would otherwise be infringing our patent. And for the right to do that, you pay us 3% or 5% or 10% of your revenue. And last, this kind of goes without saying at this point, but we really need an IP asset, a patent application, a copyright, or what have you, to put into a license contract. And to make this a little bit more concrete, I wanted to tell you a success story. So this was out of the energy sciences area at the lab. It's a graphene speaker. A scientist developed a graphene speaker that takes the place of that, or at least can act as a substitute to these dynamic speakers that have big magnets and solenoids, and the magnets travel up and down. So the scientists used graphene and applied graphene to make a static speaker, or an electrostatic speaker, where you send positive and negative electrical pulses, and that graphene, which is biased, vibrates up and down depending on the rate at ones and zeros or pluses and minuses that you send to it. And it had really great performance, and it got a lot of buzz. You can see a lot of the quotes here from pretty prominent magazines and outlets in the field: MIT Tech Review, The Verge, Gizmodo. They were all pretty impressed by that. And we were able to turn that into a license with a company called Graph Audio. And Graph Audio is out there marketing this technology, presenting at CES in Las Vegas, getting a lot of rave reviews, raising money, and is intending to enter production soon. So that is the success story and the summary of both patents and copyrights and IP generally, and how Berkeley Lab and why Berkeley Lab engages in tech transfer the way we do. So with that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take a couple. If not, I will pass it off to, I believe, Virginia. Maybe a minute or two if there are any questions, Ruby.
So, hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I do have a question. So for the example you showed, the graphene case, so so they apply for the patent after their publication, or is before?
Yeah, so the way the timing of it is, the Berkeley Lab scientist does his or her research. They told IPO about their invention, this graphene speaker. We filed a patent application before that first public disclosure. If you remember back when we were talking about how you negotiate with the patent office, it's all about novelty and not obviousness. And as soon as something is published, that can be considered prior art, even if it's your own publication. So if you publish, a month ago and file a patent application today, when you enter this negotiation, the patent office will say, well, that was your publication. Or that publication, even though it was yours, is prior art to this patent application. There are some subtleties by jurisdiction, but you can generally think of that's kind of how it works. So in this example, it was research done, disclosure, record of invention given to IPO. IPO files the patent application, and then publication happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. So how long it takes for this whole process?
Good question. I will go back to this process, just like here we are. Okay, so tech intake and eval, that can take anywhere from a month or so to 3 months. Generally, we would ask if you think you have an invention around the time that you first make it and test it, and it generally behaves the way you were expecting, but preferably 3 to 6 months in advance of the first publication in a journal or where have you. IP prosecution can take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. It takes a long time. These last two steps, license development and license maintenance, they don't need to wait for IP prosecution to end or patent prosecution to end. As soon as we even have an application filed, we can begin license development and license maintenance. So IP processing, license development, and license maintenance can all occur in parallel. As soon as we file the patent application, we can start development and maintenance of a license.
Russell, there's a follow-up question from Wan Li Yang.
Sure.
I thought that U.S. authors have a 1 year period after the publication to file a patent application.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. I mentioned there were some subtleties depending on jurisdiction, and that's a really important one and one that should be emphasized. So basically everywhere but the US, as soon as you publish, you are not allowed to file a patent application. Well, you're allowed to, but you'll never get a patent issued. In the US, you have up to 1 year. It's called the 1 year grace period in the US, up to 1 year after that first publication to file in the US. So if you were to publish for the first time on January 1st of this year, we would have up until 31st of this year to file an application and not have that initial publication held against us. And that's only in the US though. As soon as everywhere else in the world, China, Europe, India, Japan, Korea, South America, everywhere else, for all intents and purposes, as soon as you publish, you lose the ability to get a patent.
How about one more question and then we'll move to
transition.
From Max Armstrong, what happens when one of the inventors wants to use the LBNL patent for a commercial purpose, that is, for a spin-off company?
Sure. So that's kind of a special case of this license development and license maintenance. So we encourage that, but we do have obligations to DOE and to society generally to make sure that we are being fair. The mindset or the thinking is the US taxpayer funded the research, and therefore the US taxpayer should at least get a fair shot at commercializing the invention. That's the thinking. How it works in practice is we file a patent application, and if the inventor comes forward and says, I would like to commercialize this, then we take a 30-day, 1-month pause where we broadcast that invention and make as many people aware of it as we can. And we say, and we put everyone on notice, hey, this invention is available. If someone comes back, if someone doesn't come back, at the end of those 30 days, we are able to move forward with the license. The other piece is if the inventor wants to maintain a position here at the lab and do both, have a startup and be a Berkeley Lab employee, then we need to do conflict of interest and make sure that there isn't overlapping obligations. We don't want someone working on the same subject matter as a lab scientist and as a startup founder, because then it gets a little messy. And let's say you develop a technology that's related to both. What do you do with it? Who gets what right? So it gets really messy. So if we have an inventor-backed startup, we do those two things: fairness of opportunity, make sure everyone gets at least the opportunity to commercialize, and conflict of interest and conflict of interest management if that inventor wants to stay at the lab and continue with his or her day job as a lab scientist. So with that, I think it's time to hand it over to Virginia.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yes, very quickly.
So during the broadcast, during the 1 month period, is there any preference given to specific people who want to license the patent, or is it just to the highest bidder?
No, so so assuming we get interest from more than one party, we can do a competition, and that competition, it's not the highest bidder. Our goal, our mission, which is the same mission as the lab, is to bring our science solutions to the world. What we do not want unequivocally is a company that maybe licenses that technology with no intention of commercializing it themselves, because maybe it competes with a technology they already have on the market and they just want to sit on it. We do not want that. And so when we look at potential partners, really the evaluation is who is best equipped to partner with us and commercialize. There are, of course, advantages, disadvantages for a large company that have a lot of resources, but they also have a lot of irons in the fire, and there's nothing to say that, you know, our technology or the product envisioned based on our technology is a high priority for them. So on the flip side, a startup might not have the same resources, but that startup lives or dies by commercializing our technology. And so there's a trade-off. And really it's really about figuring out who we think dispassionately, who we think is the best partner to bring that technology to market. And I'm happy to have an additional conversation about that offline if you'd like. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go on mute now and stop sharing and pass it off to Virginia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As Russell mentioned, my name is Virginia de la Puente, and I manage the NDA MTA group, which is a group within IPO that is dedicated to working on all material transfer agreements and non-disclosure agreements for all the groups at the lab. Oops. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk about the basics of material transfer agreements, non-disclosure agreements, and hybrid agreements, which are agreements that require the transfer of materials and information, and also data use agreements, which are pretty much a non-disclosure agreement inbound or outbound with special requirements. So as far as, I'm starting with material transfer agreements because material transfer agreements are where we see most of the issues, or many issues. Material transfer agreements are always required whenever material is going in or out of the lab. So that includes collaborations with academic collaborators and also collaboration and also any kind of interaction with the company. When we have a request for a material transfer agreement that is outbound or a two-way transfer of material with the company, we will usually ask the requester how that research is funded. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But that is a critical factor for us when we're working with a company and providing them with material or receiving material from them. Material transfer agreements are often also used to initiate work in a strategic partnership project or a cooperative research and development agreement. For example, in the bioscience area, there could be a strain of bacteria or some kind of plasmid or gene that needs to be transferred to get the work started. And one thing I did want to point out about material transfer agreements that also applies to non-disclosure agreements and data use agreements, sorry about that, and data use agreements are that those can only be signed by IPO. There could be specific circumstances where we ask the principal investigator or the requester to acknowledge the agreement, but the actual agreement can only be signed by someone in IPO. Not all material transfer agreements receive the same amount of scrutiny. When we receive a request for a material transfer agreement to an academic organization, we usually assume that that is in response to collaboration that is existing or in response to a paper that was published, and maybe based on the paper, the scientists want to initiate a collaboration. But we do give, as I mentioned in the last slide, more scrutiny to MTAs with companies. There needs to be a specific reason why we're sending material out to a company or exchanging materials with the company. And those are pretty limited circumstances. If we're sending material out to a company or exchanging material, it would usually only be for what we refer to as a beta test agreement or a feasibility study, where a company wants to determine if they want to move forward with a strategic partnership project or a CRADA, or if they're interested in licensing one of our technologies and they will want to test out the technology beforehand. Another possibility is an ARPA-E type grant or other DOE grant where the company is receiving funding separately from Berkeley Lab to conduct the research. But overall, an MTA is not the right vehicle to conduct the work. If there is actually, if there are going to be expectations for how we would use the material, then we may follow up with the requester and see if it would make more sense for this to be a strategic partnership project or a CRADA. And lastly, I want to mention a type of material transfer agreement that we receive on a relatively consistent basis. When we're receiving very valuable materials from a company, generally what the company will require some kind of license, a limited license, basically the equivalent of an option agreement to any inventions that we develop using their material. And we have a means of negotiating that. Then a few of the issues that we may follow up with a requester on when we receive a request for material transfer agreement during the course of negotiating material transfer agreement, we'll confirm the flow of the materials. If, say, for example, a scientist expects to receive material, but there's something in the agreement request that talks about derivatizing that material or changing it and then making it accessible to the company, we'll follow up with the requester and confirm what the flow of materials should be. Also, we need to confirm that any material we'll be sending out doesn't contain components from a third party. An example of that, again, in the biosciences area, would be if we're sending out a strain of bacteria with a plasmid that has a gene or some other components. If we are sending out materials that have third-party components, we need to do a little bit more research to make sure that we have the right under a material transfer agreement or a purchase order or some kind of document that allows us to resend materials. So moving on to non-disclosure agreements. A non-disclosure agreement would be needed anytime we're sending or receiving information that is not publicly available. Many of our academic institutions, before we initiate a collaboration, will require a non-disclosure agreement. Companies that are interested in initiating a research project with Berkeley Lab would often require a non-disclosure agreement, and licensing discussions would require a non-disclosure agreement. One benefit of having a non-disclosure agreement when discussing ideas or inventions with a company or an academic collaborator is that if there's a non-disclosure agreement in place, those discussions are not considered a public disclosure, which, as Russell mentioned in his presentation, would prevent us from filing for certain patent rights or filing for broader patent rights. A couple of issues that we commonly follow up with in non-disclosure agreements are how information we receive is tracked. For example, if we're receiving a lot of what I refer to as tangible information, just even an email with an attachment, we ask that in our agreements, we always ask that that material be marked as confidential or proprietary. The reason is if there's a lab or an area, for example, like the ABPDU or the JGI that has a lot of industry interaction, if the material is not marked, it can be difficult to keep track of what we're getting, what information the area or division is receiving that has those confidentiality obligations. And likewise, another common provision that we follow up with our requesters is if there's non-disclosure agreements most often cover verbal or visual disclosures, and those typically need to be summarized in writing by the party disclosing that information and provided to the other party. Again, we recommend that we keep that provision in the agreement when we're dealing with areas or divisions that have a lot of interaction with collaborators or industry. But if it gets to the point where we can't conclude the agreement without some of these terms, we can be, in some cases, we can be flexible on those. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what I refer to as hybrid agreements, which are agreements that require the transfer of materials and information. Usually we see a request for these agreements when a scientist or someone at Berkeley Lab already has a project in mind and wants to send out specific material and describe that material, or receive specific material and describe that material. So we, again, in this case, we're more careful when we're dealing with companies in this area, and we'll again follow up on where the funding would be coming for this work. And then lastly, data use agreements. As I mentioned initially, data use agreements are basically a non-disclosure agreement in or out, but for a specific data set. It allows us a specific, usually pretty valuable data set, and it allows the party receiving that data set to use the data set for only one specific purpose. Sometimes a project is designated for that purpose. And oftentimes there are security requirements with data use agreements. Two issues that we may follow up with the requester are just confirming that there is not personally identifiable information. We can't receive a data set with personally identifiable information, which I just included a general definition here, but basically we can't receive information that has one or more components that would allow us to track down who the individual was providing that information. And then if a data use agreement has certain security requirements, we would need to check with IT to make sure that we're able to meet those requirements. I just wanted to give a small plug for our IPO portal. For any request for an MTA, NDA, or data use agreement, we ask that you please put those through our IPO, our portal listed here. It can be found through our website. And the more complete information you're able to include in any request, the more quickly we'll be able to get through that request and start negotiating the agreement. So thank you for your time, and I guess I can take a couple of minutes to answer any questions, or we could save questions for the end.
Virginia, there is one question that came up. Under what circumstances may the LBNL researcher sign an NDA as an individual without binding LBNL as an institution?
Oh, that's a really good question. So if an LBL researcher scientist is serving as a consultant for a company, and it will be engaging with that company separate from their role as a scientist at Berkeley Lab. I mean, of course, they were engaged as a consultant because of their expertise at Berkeley Lab, but if they've gone through the process of either at the beginning of the process of becoming a consultant or within the consultant agreement, if there's a confidentiality provision, in that case, a scientist would be able to sign would be able to sign the confidentiality agreement themselves. But I encourage people who have any questions on that to come to us directly, because there are some risks. Then the scientist is taking on all the liability in case anything goes wrong, or there's a breach of the agreement, or any information gets out.
One other comment to make on that, I mentioned conflict of interest earlier. If you are going to consult outside of your role at Berkeley Lab, the lab wants to learn about it through a COPA form. So a COPA is a compensated outside professional activity, consulting being one example. So if you do want to consult, please fill out the COPA form and work with the lab to make sure it's okay for you to work outside of the lab. There are regulations and rules around being both an employee of the lab and having outside engagements. Okay.
Well, next up is Shanshan Taylor. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. 1 second. Oops. There we go.
Thank you, Virginia. Bear with me when I launch this. Okay. Oh, shoot. Here it is. Yeah, my name is Shanshan Li. I'm one of the TCAs at IPO. My portfolio is primarily, for energy technology applications. Today's topic, I'm gonna just give you a little teaser on the tech funding opportunities for tech maturation. Now, there are a few opportunities for DOE-funded technologies. Tech Commercialization Fund is one of them. For this fiscal year, roughly $25 million will be made available for this program. Now, you have to be a lab employee in order to apply for this fund. There is also a requirement and that a non-federal source must be used to fund 50% of the project cost. And there are 2 levels of funding for this program. Topic 1 is has to have already done proof of concept, and it's designed to attract commercial partner with a funding level of 100,000 to 250,000 for a performance period of 6 to 18 months. Topic 2 projects requires a credit partner who's going to work on specific applications for prototype optimization or scale up with funding level of 250,000 to $1.5 million available for each award, and a performance period of 12 to 36 months. Next opportunity is called SBIR, STTR, Tech Transfer Opportunities. And now the overall SBIR and TTR program budget for this fiscal year is over $300 million. The Tech Transfer Opportunity TTO program budget comes out of this overall budget. Now, you have to have formed a small businesses in order to apply for this grant. And as an applicant, you need to be willing to work on lab developed technologies. Funding level for this program, there are 2. Phase 1 is for feasibility and proof of concept type of work. Award can be around 200,000 or 250,000. For a performance period of 6 to 12 months. Phase 2 award is for development of prototype or process improvements and scale up development for amount about 1.1 million to or 1.6 million depending on the topic, and for a project duration of 24 months. Now, internally, the lab directorate also offers innovation grant to selective projects with high potential impact. The funding amount for each award ranges around thousands of dollars to $100,000. In summary, I mean, this is just a teaser. I want you to take away is, you need to know that you have developed a technology for patentable invention or software that must have to be funded by DOE. IPO must have filed a patent application or obtained permission from DOE to assert copyright in the case of software. Alignment with the DOE program office's roadmap is very important, because having a brief discussion with your DOE program manager about your intent to apply for these opportunities can put you on the path for success. Opportunities ahead, in August, there will be calls coming out for SBIR, STTR, TTOs, and participating program offices are going to be different this time around than the first release, which we just closed. In September, there will be calls coming out for Tech Commercialization Fund. Now, Innovation Grant, we accept applications on a rolling basis, so you can contact me anytime if you wish. Here's my contact information. If you need more, have questions, just give me a call. I think we're short on time. I'll hand it over to Gregg.
Thanks, Shanshan.
Thank you, Shanshan. I'll share my screen. All right, hello, good afternoon. My name is Gregg Scharfstein, and I recently joined the Intellectual Property Office a couple months ago. And as Russell said, I am the Commercialization Associate for the Physical Sciences area and Energy Sciences area. I also manage the entrepreneurial trainings and events hosted by our office. And I want to tell you about two exciting events coming up. Hope you can check them out. So first, on Thursday, May 14th at 12 p.m., we have an exciting webinar called Pitch for a Pilot. And so our guest speaker, serial entrepreneur and Bay Area local, Jeff Wallace, will share his experience about the value of pitching for a pilot or some type of collaboration before seeking private funding. The goal with this method is that the pilot provides market validation, and this validation then can attract funding. So Jeff will give you the knowledge and the tools to build and deliver your own pitch, and there will be extensive Q&A for this webinar. So once again, Thursday, May 14th at 12 p.m., Pitch for a Pilot webinar with our guest speaker, Jeff Wallace. And then the second event I want to tell you about is called a virtual I-Core Light training. And this will be either at the end of May or at the end of June. We are still in the planning phases right now. So I-Core Light training is a 2-week training where we provide the method to better understand product market fit for those interested in technology transfer. And this method can also be applied to researchers seeking DOE funding or other research funding, as it can be applied to your funding office, the program, and the program manager's needs to write stronger proposals, especially if your proposals have some commercialization components to them. So if you're interested in the virtual I-Core Light training, we have an info session tomorrow, Friday, May 1st at 3 p.m. Please email me and I'll add you to the calendar invite. If you can't make tomorrow's meeting at 3 p.m., please email me anyway, and we'll set up a time to chat about the I-Core Light program, which once again is a 2-week program. It'll be either at the end of May or end of June. And yeah, it's a very exciting program. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to Ruby.
Well, we have actually run out of time. I think that the IPO team can stay and answer questions if you would like, or feel free to email your questions to ipo@lbl.gov, or just reach out to any of us on the IPO team. But I do want to thank everyone for participating in this session. If you have ideas for other topics you'd like to hear about from the Intellectual Property Office, please let us know. As a reminder, this session was recorded and will be made available on ipo.lbl.gov. Thank you so much. So for those who have additional questions and would like to ask them now, please feel free to stay. But otherwise, presentations are at an end. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Anyone have questions? Who's on the who's still on the line? Okay, well, it doesn't sound like it. Oh, it looks like we maybe do. Oh, Joseph Chu asked where we'll post this. Ruby, I think, mentioned that it'll be on ipo.lbl.gov, the IPO website. Ruby, do you know where on the website you might post?
I'll post it in the news section of the IPO website, but I will also put out a note, possibly in Elements or Research News when it's ready. One other question from Winnie Chung. Will we find more information on pilot for a pitch on the IPO website also? It is not, but if you go to the LBL calendar and just go to May 14th, there's a brief description there. I'll be also posting information about pilot for a pitch on Elements.
Actually, I'll ask a question of Russell, because I'm still learning about this, and I get this a lot from people, and I'm new at this, so I can play that card right now. So a lot of people say, how do I know when it's an invention? Like, I'm doing my work and I want to do my research, but so what kind of signals to me that, hey, this could be an invention?
Yeah, so an invention, from a technical standpoint, for something to be an invention and be a patentable invention, it has to be useful and novel and not obvious. And I think when you're deciding whether or not to talk to someone about it, I would say, think about the first two criteria: that something is useful, that it solves a problem that you're aware of. Maybe the technology lowers cost, or it makes things more efficient, or provides higher performance in some way or another. It meets that first criterion. It has usefulness. And then the second is novelty. If you're doing something in a way that hasn't been done before, and if it's also useful, then I think that is worth a disclosure, at least worth a conversation. So I would say those two things. I wouldn't worry so much about obviousness, that third kind of leg of the patentability stool. I wouldn't worry about that up front. It's pretty tricky, and it's kind of hard to get a sense of early on. But those first two, I think, the usefulness and the novelty, again, if you think you've done something useful, from a kind of commercial standpoint, is it cheaper? Is it faster? Is it stronger? Is it more scalable? Does it have some kind of like usefulness that you can imagine or you can project into a product? And then is it novel? Are you, do you think it hasn't occurred anywhere else or been invented anywhere else?
Shanshan, there is a question related to funding. When will the STTR, SBIR applicants get notified about the decision, and when would funding start?
The funding announcement, so the tech transfer IPO's role in this program is that we recommend the lab develop technologies for the SBIR office to list as a topic, and the topics for each round of SBIR, STTR funding is announced annually, I think twice a year, and that the decision whether our nominated technology gets selected to be announced in these funding opportunity announcement will be we'll get notification from DOE 3 months after we submit these nomination to DOE. So we do get notification throughout the process. If someone has applied and then and if someone's winning the award, we do get these notifications throughout the year. Typically, I think an award doesn't commence until the following year.
Any last questions for the IPO team? If not, I think we can wrap this up. And I just want to say thank you again to everyone for participating. If you have any ideas for additional sessions from the IPO team, please do let us know. Thank you, everyone.